Finn subtly lifted her head and looked in the direction Jackson had moved.
Is he heading straight to the village chief's house?
From her perspective, there were too many suspicious things about this village. Hadn't she noticed a woman among the people walking by, someone whose steps were unusually graceful? Even Finn could tell that woman wasn't ordinary.
Damn thieves.
Through her various dealings with Sinar, she had come to understand just how deeply the Black Blade Bandits' influence had penetrated the kingdom. It was likely connected to central nobility or a lord with a vast estate. The biggest problem among them was, she was deep in thought, walking under the cover of darkness. Her instincts as a ranger led her to move stealthily, avoiding the gaze of others. Her steps were cautious, always aware of whether someone might be following her. She made her way toward the watermill on the hill, and as she neared it, something struck her head. Finn reacted. She twisted to minimize the impact, reducing the damage. Reacting just before getting hit was half luck, and if half was luck, the other half was skill. Ever since encountering Enkrid, she had been relentlessly training in Aelkara's style martial arts with Audin and Sinar. She focused especially on defense. It wasn't so much by choice as it was by necessity.
One hit and you meet the gods, sister.
Audin's fists, when hit wrong, were like knocking on heaven's door.
You're full of openings.
Sinar would often strike her from behind, outside her awareness, aiming for the back of her head or neck. For these reasons, Finn had become more sensitive, her senses sharper, and her reaction time quicker. There was a sound of impact, but Finn neither fainted nor fell. She had tucked her chin and tensed her trapezius muscles, so the blow aimed at the back of her head only grazed near her ear. It made her head ring. Her attacker didn't wait. Another strike came immediately, this time aiming for her legs. He was a skilled fighter. The first ambush targeted above, and the next below, tactics that were hard to counter. But Finn wasn't caught off guard this time either. She bent her knees and braced herself. It was an Aelkara-style defensive technique. When the attacker's foot struck Finn's shin, she twisted her body slightly, deflecting the blow.
Damn bastard.
Her head was still ringing, but realizing she would be overpowered if this continued, she swiftly drew the short sword from her sword belt. Without a second thought, she slashed horizontally. Nothing caught on the blade. It seemed her assailant had retreated. Finn's vision blurred, causing her to frown.
Don't move. If you move, you die.
The voice came from behind her, to the left. She also heard the click of a crossbow being cocked.
Damn it.
She was caught in a bad situation. Her opponent was skilled in ambushes. More importantly, they seemed to have been waiting for her. It was a planned attack. Dangerous.
You think we're a bunch of blind fools? Damn, bitch. Maybe we'll chop you up and sell you to a cheap brothel, where you won't fetch more than a few coins.
The man who had struck her spoke while holding a short club. His language was not just rough, but downright filthy. Finn focused instead of replying. Sweat trickled down her temples. The cold of winter was the last thing she felt. Her head was still spinning, though it was better than before. The immediate concern was getting out of this situation, and for that, she needed to assess it first.
Don't shoot.
Finn spoke as she suddenly raised both hands. The short sword she had let go of fell to the ground, sticking into the dirt at an angle.
Crazy bitch, do you even know where you are?
The thief with the club twisted his mouth into a sneer.
This doesn't look good.
By pretending to surrender, she began to grasp the situation. There were three main points. First, the villagers weren't dumb or foolish. Secondly, it meant that they had made a foolish mistake. And third, not everything was going according to plan. The original plan was to observe the village for 2 days, and then sweep through it with the unit they had on standby.
Find the evidence.
Based on that, the priority was to obtain the local lord's permission to act. The border guard was part of the lord's estate, but beyond its borders, it was technically someone else's land. In fact, this situation was tangled with various political factors. Marcus intended to turn the surrounding area into the border guard's territory, and believed this kind of operation was necessary to exert his influence. He was certainly angry about the drug dealers and the assassination group sent by the Black Blade Bandits, but there was also calculation involved. Even if he didn't want to, Marcus's mind always leaned toward politics. He planned to liberate the village and reorganize it with the innocent villagers as the foundation. The goal was to transform the village from a den of thieves producing drugs into a community under the protection of the border guard. Of course, the local noble who officially owned the estate would be furious, but there were plenty of ways to handle that. The best scenario would be to find evidence linking the lord to the bandits, but even if they couldn't, it wasn't the end of the world. Marcus knew how to wield influence, and he was the kind of man who could swallow a village whole if he played his cards right. Starting was crucial. Once you took one village, the next would be easier. Giving up one village wouldn't stop at just one, but who could predict that? The local lord was just a pig-headed idiot with nothing but dung in his brain. They had made various preparations and tied up many loose ends, which was the background to this operation, but things had gone wrong from the start. Of course, Finn couldn't know all of this. She simply reminded herself of her mission, remaining the loyal soldier she was. Finn thought. Finding evidence seemed like water spilled on dry soil.
We've walked into a trap.
They had been ambushed. Sweat ran down Finn's face as she prepared for her next move. She wasn't about to just sit there and take it. Fight back with all you've got. She had learned something from watching Enkrid. Keep moving forward because you don't know how to quit, and by moving forward you change. Finn had watched Enkrid closely. Soon she kicked the sword embedded in the ground. The sword sprang free and shot forward. Simultaneously, Finn drew 2 short daggers hidden in her forearm, each just over a span long. It was time to fight. Even if there was no chance of winning, if the moment called for it, she had to do it. This was after Jackson had slipped out through the window. Enkrid absent-mindedly stared outside.
How did he manage to get out through that hole?
The window was small. Jackson had slipped through it as if he'd oiled his body, and the way he did it was remarkable. He didn't struggle. He simply gauged the size of the window and his body. Then, with a single leap, he smoothly slipped through. It was as if he had straightened his body in mid-air, or as if someone had pulled him from outside. He vanished as if he had flown away. Jackson had an astonishing sense of proprioception.
He sees, judges, and moves his body with perfect precision.
It was a feat possible only because he had an impeccable understanding of his body and its capabilities. Could Enkrid do it himself? He wasn't so sure. His curiosity ended there. Enkrid gazed beyond the window where Jackson had disappeared. The moonlight outside seemed to scatter like broken dust. It was a bright, moonlit night. After a moment of observing the outside, he turned his attention back to the room. It was a winter night, so there should have been a chill in the air, but the brazier, filled with heated stones and glowing red charcoal, dispelled it. Beneath the coals were logs about the size of his forearm. Enkrid dragged the brazier to the front of the bed and stared at it quietly. When he placed a log on top, the red-hot coals began to singe the wood, causing it to crackle as it started to burn. Soon, red tongues of flame licked up and ignited the log. He watched as the log began to burn with a faint crackling sound. Enkrid's gaze was distant and unfocused. He simply sat there, gazing at the flames, his body half slouched and entirely relaxed. The fire blazed, sparks flew, and the sound of the burning wood combined with the heat pushing back the cold air. The warmth created by the meeting of heat and cold surrounded him. It was as if someone had gently cradled his body and laid him down on the bed. Soft straw cushioned his body. The bed was soft, his belly was full, and his back was warm. As the comfortable air enveloped him, it felt as though he was being held in a mother's embrace. Although Enkrid was an orphan and had never known a mother's touch, he felt a similar warmth now. Like a child, he curled up. The warm bath in a wooden tub he had taken for 6 coins had relaxed him completely. Enkrid fell into a short dream. In it, he was a child whining to his mother. Then he set out on a long journey, only to face mortal danger after 10 days. Having barely survived, he felt a sudden wave of regret.
Why did I ever leave home?
Once he left, all he found was suffering. Difficulties piled up. Even the slightest mistake put his life at risk. It was like crossing between cliffs on a tiny rope.
Will you still cross?
Someone asked. He could have simply gone back home. But Enkrid did not. Despite the peace and comfort, the pastoral meadows, he didn't turn back. Even though all the things he loved were behind him, he didn't retreat. Despite missing his mother's embrace and his father's large hands, he didn't turn back.
I must cross. Why? Do I need a reason? Aren't there things one does without a reason? No, everything has a reason, even if you don't realize it. Why are you walking this path?
Enkrid thought it was a question without an answer, but in the dream he responded without hesitation.
Because it's fun, is that all? Would you rather see a smile or a frown? Do you prefer pain or joy? What?
He couldn't see the face of the person asking the question. The last words came out aloud.
I'm walking the path that I find enjoyable and right.
He had no doubts about it. Enkrid didn't even call it a conviction. He opened his eyes. It had been an extremely short dream. The firewood hadn't even burned out yet. The log was still not completely charred, so it was indeed a very brief rest. And yet, his body felt light, his steps were swift, and his hands were filled with strength. Normally it would take some time after waking up for strength to return to the body, but not this time. It was as if someone had infused every muscle fiber with power, making his body brim with energy. Then someone knocked on the door. The sound of knocking reached his ears.
Are you in there?
It was the voice of the tavern servant.
Are you there?
The servant asked again. Enkrid quickly dressed. He wrapped his inner armor around him like a bandage and threw on a thin leather armor over it. He also fastened his sword belt. The speed at which he armed himself was beyond exceptional. Why wouldn't it be? If you weren't skilled with a sword, you'd end up doing a lot of menial tasks. Enkrid had served many other mercenaries. Even then, to survive, he had to be meticulous in putting on his armor and preparing his weapons. His speed in doing so was remarkable, and so he finished arming himself.
You're in there, but you're not answering.
The servant's voice had a hint of amusement.
Hey, you idiot.
Then came the words. There was a click, and the door opened. The lock was meaningless. The open door allowed the light from the room's brazier and the light from outside to meet and clash. The lights didn't compete, they simply did their job, illuminating the surroundings. The inn's hallway was narrow. Beyond it stood the tavern servant, the innkeeper, and beside them, a man with a thick beard like a bush. Each of them had gleaming eyes and an air of arrogance.
3?
Enkrid skipped over the small talk and asked directly. He lowered his head slightly, then tilted his eyes up to ask. As he spoke, Enkrid adjusted the position of his sword belt. He shifted it slightly forward, making it easier to draw his weapon, just a bit more comfortable. The servant sneered at him. What a foolish sight it was, this idiot clumsily gearing up.
What? 3? This crazy bastard must be out of his mind.
The servant sneered. Enkrid continued adjusting his gear. He had recently realized the importance of small preparations. The angle of the dwarf's gladius on his right hip wasn't quite to his liking. He adjusted it, pulling it tighter.
You can handle a sword, can't you? So why the hell are you acting so clumsy?
Suddenly he thought of Kreis. A nagging voice in his mind reminded him not to act. For a moment, Enkrid resented a world that didn't appreciate his acting skills. Surely, when he reached the estate, there would be a playwright who recognized his outstanding talent.
There's no need to drag this out, right?
The servant sneered as he spoke. Normally, the servant was someone who exploited his opponent's weaknesses and moments of carelessness, but to him, Enkrid seemed too clumsy. The fairy beside him might be a bit tricky to deal with, though.
Do you even know where you are?
The servant was brimming with confidence. He was sure he could take down these intruders who had wandered into the village.
Hey, kill him already.
The bearded man who had been watching from the back spoke up. No need for words. This wasn't some fancy parlor for idle chatter. Enkrid gave his sword belt one last tug forward. Now the hilt of the sword rested perfectly in front of his hip. Finally, his gear felt just right. He lifted his head and straightened his back. During this time, the tavern servant dusted off his hands. The smirk that had formed on his face was far from the innocent look he had worn earlier. His eyes now gleamed with deadly intent. Enkrid took it all in. In the slowed perception of time, he noted every expression and every glance. They were only 3 or 4 steps apart. The servant threw a dagger, and Enkrid tilted his head to the side. He gripped his sword, but didn't draw it just yet. The dagger whizzed past, grazing his hair, and embedded itself in the wall behind him.
So you've got some skill, huh?
The servant shouted fiercely, raising both hands. Each held another dagger. Enkrid instinctively gauged his opponent's physical abilities from the way he moved, his posture, and the act of throwing the daggers. This led to a minor adjustment. He slid his left foot forward. The leather boots made a quiet scraping sound as they moved. It was a subtle movement that no one noticed. Now everything was perfect. The minor preparations were complete. The servant, apparently confident in his knife-throwing skills, shook his hands once more while the tavern owner behind him drew a short sword. The sound of metal rang out, as if each weapon was declaring its presence. Enkrid moved with a soft murmur.
Esther.
He pressed down on his left big toe, lowering his waist. In a crouched position, he leaned forward. With a swift motion, 2 daggers brushed past him and embedded themselves deeply into the wall of the inn behind him. Enkrid drew his sword. The inn room wasn't spacious enough to swing a longsword freely, especially with a wall blocking the entrance. They were counting on that. Even if he drew his sword here, how was he going to cut anyone? He could almost hear the servant's words. Enkrid used his left hand to press down on the scabbard, creating an angle. Instead of a horizontal slash, he switched to a vertical one and unsheathed his sword. With force behind the drawn blade, he slashed upward from below, cutting the servant from the groin to the middle of the chest. Sk! The sound of fabric, the leather armor underneath, muscles and some bones being sliced through was like a low whisper. The sword was that fast. Enkrid gauged the distance to his opponent and cut just a finger's width deep. That was enough to kill a person. All the preparations, adjusting the position of his sword belt and positioning his feet, had been for this single strike. He was satisfied.
Ugh.
The servant, whose lungs and vocal cords hadn't been damaged, let out a short death throe, spewing blood and entrails as he collapsed.
You bastard.
The innkeeper, who was also a bandit, shouted as he drew a short sword. But he didn't step inside. Hadn't he just witnessed the servant being killed in a single strike? At that moment, a dark shadow swooped down from above, striking the innkeeper on the head. Crack thud! The bandit innkeeper's neck was half broken, and 3 claw marks were etched across his face, severing his nose and bursting an eye. It was the result of a strike from a lake panther's front paw. Usually docile but terrifying when in battle, the lake panther's power was immense. Esther, who had killed the bandit with a single blow, landed lightly beside Enkrid. Her steps were light as she descended. From her movements, it seemed she was quicker than usual. Enkrid could feel his own condition just from that one sword draw.
My body feels incredibly light.
He was in excellent condition, very good indeed. With a soft hum of satisfaction, Enkrid looked up to see a pair of wide, glaring eyes under a bushy beard. The man then spoke. It was a shout mixed with tension, fear, dread, and excitement.
Kill him.
With those words, a cracking sound was heard. Enkrid's keen instincts quickly identified the source. It came from above, at the back.
Damn it, what's this?
Another voice cried out. The sound came from the bed. There were 2 beds, and the noise came from the one Jackson had chosen. Soon, a ripping sound followed as the fabric on the ceiling was torn. Jackson had tried to do something, but it seemed he was blocked by the fabric on the ceiling. As soon as it tore, something fell. Esther let out a shout. What fell looked like a leather-made orb, and it quickly exploded with a pop. It wasn't a loud explosion. There was no pressure or light, just green smoke spreading out. Without even smelling it, Enkrid started to feel dizzy. It was poison gas. Adding to that, an arrow whizzed through the window. Enkrid swung his sword quickly, deflecting the incoming arrow. With a snap, the arrow split in half and bounced off the floor. A stray arrow is always dangerous, but in a situation where you're dodging daggers flying at your face, this was hardly a threat. However, the poison gas was another matter. That's what drew his attention backward. The bearded man slammed the door shut behind the dead servant and innkeeper.
Blocking the door and trying to kill us with poison.
Enkrid held his breath, and without hesitation turned to the side. Arrows were aimed from outside the window, and the bearded man was blocking the door. Should he break through the door? No, given how things had gone awry, it seemed likely that they had something prepared on that side as well. It was both intuition and a 6th sense, and he was right. The bearded bandit had released the poison orb the moment he saw Enkrid's sword skills. A few breaths of it, and one's insides would twist, leading to death in a fit of vomiting, however. The poison had a limited range and was harmless if not inhaled. If Enkrid had forced the door open, the bandit was prepared to release more of the same poison into the hallway. The bearded man thought to himself.
Stupid bastard. Does he even know where he is?
He didn't know who his opponent was. He simply assumed it was a fool who had wandered in without understanding the situation. This was a village run by the Black Blade Bandits, one of their key operations. Did this intruder think the guards here were just random thugs? Even though a senior member had recently left, taking with him a top-tier assassin, there were still some formidable fighters left. More importantly, this place was one of their strongholds. Despite his appearance, the bearded man was a strategist who could plan multiple contingencies. He had anticipated, judged, and believed he had successfully restricted the intruder's actions. But Enkrid didn't concern himself with what the bearded man was doing, or what was currently happening. All of that could be dealt with later. Just by observing Esther's reaction, he knew the poison smoke was dangerous. However, it wasn't spreading quickly. It was a heavy smoke. Though smoke doesn't have weight, it appeared that way. It spread slowly and densely, rather than dispersing widely. The problem was that the area where Enkrid stood was now overlapping with the smoke. If that's the case, then he just needed to move out of its range. Enkrid turned his body. There was no need to steady his breath. The inn was a makeshift building, made of wood with thin walls. He could hear Sinar and Finn's voices clearly through them. The bandits had deliberately made the walls thin to eavesdrop easily. But again, this wasn't something Enkrid needed to know. He turned towards the wall and swung his sword. There was no need to use Ragnar's severance. The blade sliced through the wall cleanly. After 2 more swings, he kicked the wall. Several pillars and the wooden planks making up the wall broke with a crunch, creating enough space for a person to move through. He broke through the wall and moved into the adjacent room. It was supposed to be the room where the ferry company commander and Finn were, but instead, there were only 3 men with gleaming eyes.
Shit.
One of them muttered. Their language was foul. Enkrid didn't hesitate. Since the smoke hadn't spread into this room, he could breathe freely as he swung his sword. Slice, slice, thud! With 2 short slashes, he decapitated 2 men, and then he pierced the heart of the last one. Frog would be horrified if he saw this. Putting that brief thought aside, Enkrid then struck the wall near the window with his gloved fist. The window frame and part of the wall shattered. Even though the framework was made of wood, there were bricks here and there, but Enkrid shattered everything with sheer force. Several more arrows were fired at him from outside, but he easily dodged them, breaking through and rushing out. He rolled sideways onto the roof of the house next to him. As he rolled, arrows thudded into the spot where Enkrid had just been. One of them was aimed at where he would land. While rolling on the roof, Enkrid slammed his palm into it. With a loud crash, the roof broke open, creating a hole, and the recoil propelled Enkrid's body even faster to the side. The arrows continued to hit only the spots he had just passed. After that, Enkrid smoothly rolled off the roof and landed, leaning his back against a wall. Almost as if on cue, a hand shot out from the window. Of course, knowing this would happen, Enkrid didn't hesitate and grabbed the emerging wrist, twisting it. There was no need for any special technique to break it. He did it with brute force. A sharp crack and a scream rang out together.
Ugh.
These guys had less endurance than the assassins who came before. To scream from just that, Enkrid pulled the broken wrist forward with all his might. A loud bang and a groan came from beyond the wall at the same time, either knocked out or dead. Enkrid released the broken wrist and shook his hand before stepping into the wide-open area in front of the inn. Things always have a way of getting complicated. Nothing ever goes exactly as planned. That was to be expected. So what next? You just deal with things as they come. The Black Blade bandits guarding the village didn't realize it, but with Enkrid's abilities, stamina, and skill, the unit prepared by the ferry company commander wasn't even necessary. The bandits didn't know that.
Who the hell is that guy? Kill him.
Someone shouted. Enkrid couldn't help but think that these guys were quite something. It wasn't just 1 or 2 that showed up. There were at least 20, and their numbers were growing. From somewhere, men with gleaming eyes and weapons in hand began to appear one by one.
Man, you're too good at fighting.
One of them, standing at the front, spoke, trailing off. He was one of the guards. He was the person who had caught Enkrid's attention the most when he first entered the village. In his judgment, this guard, who was now trailing off, was the most skilled in weaponry among the ones present. Sigh.
You should have just died quietly.
His tone didn't seem like an act. Karg! Esther, who had suddenly burst out of the inn, landed beside Enkrid.
The rest of your group is probably already dead.
Enkrid didn't laugh or react to his opponent's words. He simply glanced around. Then he asked,
Was that the entire village?
Quick-witted, aren't you?
The response came from behind, accompanied by the sound of metal clinking. A person with claws attached to both hands appeared. To be precise, it was a young woman. The claws, each with 3 pointed blades, gleamed. Enkrid looked at her face and thought,
So that's what she had hidden on her thigh back then.
the claws were long enough to pierce through a person's torso. She was a woman whose movements had stood out as she moved about. So she was the second person Enkrid had noted. The third person he had noticed was nowhere to be seen.
Where are you from? Judging by your appearance, you look like a soldier. You don't seem like a mercenary. Who sent you? Which fool gave the order?
The woman asked again. Enkrid spoke up.
Every single one of them. Do you have a honey pot hidden here or something?
The woman's brow furrowed at his answer. They were both responding to questions with more questions.
Do you not understand the situation you're in?
If not a honey pot, then maybe a stash of medicine hidden away somewhere.
Enkrid said, looking around. He hadn't answered her questions, but he had roughly assessed the situation. The number of people surrounding them had grown to over 30, maybe 50. All of them moved with agility. They were all competent with their blades, yet
They all seemed to be at a lower level than the ones who came to play with the border guard.
he thought. There were a few who looked unskilled, as if they had just picked up a weapon for the first time. Some of their movements were familiar. They had a similar vibe to the assassins who had come before. It was only natural. Where else would the Black Blade bandits get top-tier assassins from? They all came from strongholds created by the Black Blade bandits. These places were also known as dens. Of course, a few exceptional individuals had been left behind to guard the village. 2 of them had now surrounded Enkrid, one in front and one behind.
From your awkward acting to your unnatural demeanor, what are you really?
The woman didn't lose her temper. She had tried to provoke him, but it hadn't worked. His mental resilience was quite strong.
We could just kill you or capture you and make you talk.
The man who had been a guard said this. Enkrid still found them impressive. The growing number of enemies, their current behavior, the unfolding situation. What was the conclusion? This village was entirely a bandit stronghold.
They turned an entire village into a bandit camp.
It was proof of the immense power of the Black Blade bandits. But where did all these bandits keep coming frightened? No. Enkrid couldn't help but chuckle. Esther glanced at him from the side.
Why is he laughing?
Enkrid was secretly pleased. It seemed the power of the Black Blade bandits was exceptional. Obstacles, difficulties, hardships, crises, barriers, death, the ferrymen, even the daunting unknown. Enkrid knew how to enjoy difficulties. It was challenging, and because of that, it was enjoyable. Because it was enjoyable, it made him want to move even more. So if you asked whether those who had surrounded him were threatening,
Not at all.
that was Enkrid's judgment. Jackson twisted his body the moment the blade that had pierced through his collar touched his skin. The blade only pierced through his clothes. It grazed his skin, leaving just a small scratch. However, a stinging sensation lingered where it had grazed him.
Poisoned blade.
It didn't matter. He had been trained with various poisons from a young age, so this was of no consequence. In the same instant, Jackson smoothly reached out and grabbed his opponent's wrist. From the opponent's perspective, it must have seemed like their outstretched arm was instantly caught before they could even retract it. Every move was executed as if it had been preordained in a single breath. The man whose wrist was grabbed tried to apply force. Jackson did not resist. He followed the movement, going along with it. The opponent, even more startled by this, reflexively swung their other hand. It was a dagger with only one edge sharpened, designed for quick slashing, with the weight focused on one side. Naturally, it was coated with poison. As the blade aimed for Jackson's cheekbone, he tilted his head back, and the blade barely grazed the top of his nose. This time, not even a scratch was left. It was a fleeting moment. Normally, this would be a moment to assess the situation, but Jackson's instincts summarized all calculations into a single action. Intuition and instinct, the realm of senses. Instead of reacting, assessing what the opponent possessed, and deciding on an action. He transcended the entire process. It was a streamlined process of cognition that even Enkrid had employed multiple times with instinctual precision. There was no way Jackson, who had taught this method, would be unable to execute it. Thus, he did what was necessary.
Gah.
The voice of the unseen opponent echoed in the air. It was only natural. While blocking and dodging the two strikes, Jackson had also moved. His foot stepped on the opponent's foot, and the blade in his hand pierced the empty air. With his left hand gripping his sword, he thrust it diagonally upward, and crimson blood spurted out, scattering through the air. It was only after finishing all his movements that Jackson realized what his opponent had been carrying.
A relic that aids in concealment.
If it weren't something magical, it wouldn't have been able to completely escape his senses. Or perhaps there might be an assassin with the skill to deceive his senses. But for someone like that, their stabbing technique was pathetic. Of course, all of this was relative. The opponent was skilled at striking from behind, but they were just no match for him. The blood sprayed through the air, landed on Jackson's hair and face, but he didn't even blink. His hair seemed to absorb the blood, turning his reddish-brown hair a dark, murky crimson under the moonlight. With the blood dripping from the air and the hand holding the wrist, Jackson nonchalantly reached out, disarming his opponent and tossing the weapon onto the roof. Then, he reached for the hood covering the attacker's face and swiftly pulled it back. Naturally, his hand was thickly smeared with blood, but Jackson remained completely unperturbed. His touch was like handling an inanimate object, an eerie sight that even made the onlookers, hardened as they were, feel a chill. Jackson, unfazed, examined the item his opponent had been wearing.
A hooded robe that covers the entire body.
It was an expensive item, worth a small fortune. He methodically undid the ties and secured it. The front was tied with strings to keep it in place, and there were inner ties to wrap around the waist.
The hood is just for covering.
When worn, there were details to ensure it wouldn't slip off. He knew this because he had a similar item. Silently, he untied the strings and pocketed the robe. The now useless corpse was discarded onto the ground like a stone.
You bastard.
One by one, dark shadows emerged on the rooftops surrounding Jackson, encircling him in a tight formation. Below the rooftops, a few men wielded throwing daggers, and among them, there were 3 or 4 assassins who were clearly skilled in their craft. The man who appeared to be their leader stepped forward and opened his mouth to speak. He had watched in disbelief and only now found his voice. He had experienced all sorts of things in his life, but this felt strange, like he was facing a different species altogether. It was killing and fighting as if handling emotionless, worthless objects. Jackson silently observed his opponent. With Christ not present, his gaze carried an eerie glint. Depending on the situation, moonlight could evoke different feelings, but at that moment it symbolized nothing but the cold, merciless winter, a blade-like moonlight. Despite being soaked in blood, Jackson's hair, which appeared dark crimson, showed no visible traces. This only made him appear more demonic, something beyond human. But to show fear now would ruin the reputation they had built up. The sound of air hissing through clenched teeth echoed. The leader, who had been disguised as a merchant, glared, clenching his jaw. His eyes were bloodshot. None of them wore masks. There was no need to hide their faces. Jackson noted this naturally, taking in a few more facts. Of course, none of this showed outwardly. He remained still, holding his sword like an inanimate object.
Kill him.
The leader spoke. There was no need for more words. He was a trainer of assassins, and an elite assassin himself. He had sent his dolls, armed with relics, to do the job. A doll moved faithfully to the command to kill the opponent. But to be stopped. Not only that, but to be countered, killed, and have the relic taken. What was that? Why does he move so calmly, even in this situation? He had seemed unusual from the start. That's why they had attacked first, before he could pull any tricks. It was a valid strategy. It was an unexpected strike. Neither Enkrid, Jackson, Sinar, nor Finn could have predicted it. However, they had failed to measure Jackson's true skill and ability. They had only judged him as a nimble swordsman at best. Without a hint of a smile, Jackson stood tall. In his left hand he held the rolled-up relic. It seemed as if it had always been his. Taking someone else's belongings, this was why they were thieves. But to have it taken from them instead? Watching it happen made their insides twist.
Don't just brazenly take things.
The merchant-turned assassin trainer spat out the words. His voice subtly reverberated in their ears. This too was part of the strategy. It was a shout designed to draw attention while masking the sound of those approaching. Jackson naturally saw through the tactic. How could he not? It was a method he often used himself. 3 men aimed for Jackson's back, while another moved stealthily behind them, waiting for the right moment. The merchant with missing front teeth sneered at his opponent.
Think you've climbed a few rooftops? Idiotic fool.
There were levels among assassins. It had been surprising that Jackson dodged the first strike, but it seemed like luck was on his side. The second attempt wouldn't be so easy. Jackson didn't move. 3 sharp, needle-like assassin's blades shot toward his back. Only when they were almost upon him did Jackson move. With a sudden burst, he vanished from his spot. The trainer's eyes widened. Having consumed the blood of a fairy in his youth, he had acquired some of the fairy's unique sensitivity. But his opponent's presence, his movement, had completely slipped past his senses. In other words, he had missed it. Even his acute senses had failed to catch it. Then, the sound of slicing flesh was heard, and suddenly a blade was at his back. The trainer imagined himself dodging and counter-attacking. In his mind, he did just that. He turned around, kicked at the shins, and drew his hidden secret weapon. It was a thin, needle-like skewer designed for stabbing upwards, a unique weapon modified from the blades used by the fairies. His mind reacted and moved, but his body did not. Everything was already over. His body didn't move as he had imagined.
Why?
The leader thought briefly, but the thought didn't last long. The world spun around him. His severed head lived for just a moment longer. The optic nerves of his severed head captured something. It was the second blade he had prepared, the one held by the doll wearing a belt that silenced sound. This was the real deal, a second doll meant to succeed where the first had failed. It had stabbed its target correctly. But what he had hoped for didn't happen. The enemy whose illicit disappeared and slain 3 assassins now swung his sword down with a simple motion, blocking the secret attack. The skewer-like blade broke, and the assassin who had relied on the relic retreated immediately. It was an excellent assassin's stance, never attempting anything beyond a surprise attack. Then, somewhere nearby, there was the sound of something collapsing with a soft thud. That was all. The leader's vision faded to black. Once a notorious assassin in the Black Blade Bandits, death was fair to all.
Direction, position, air vibrations.
He couldn't sense them. This was an enemy as troublesome as the hooded robe, a skilled assassin. Not bad at all, so Jackson employed a method. He deflected the incoming attack. Using that, he gauged the direction and pinpointed the enemy's position through the vibrations. The rest was simple. Before the enemy could dodge, specifically, at the moment when the blades clashed, he threw the silent knife. The silent knife was less powerful than the whistling dagger. Its blade was barely the length of an index finger, but because it flew soundlessly from close range, it was harder to block. This was why it was also called the soundless dagger, a close-range throwing weapon and a technique. It was an example where weapon and skill merged to become an art. The blade was painted black, and after being coated with a few substances, it became a throwing knife that couldn't be seen or heard, even when reflecting light. It was one of Jackson's signature weapons, and that was the end of it. The thrown knife embedded itself so deeply into the enemy's forehead that it was barely visible. There were 6 assailants in total. The battle had happened in an instant and ended just as quickly. This is what a true assassin's battle is like. As Jackson examined the bodies, he noticed a belt.
This is an item that silences sound.
He recognized it immediately and took it. At the same time, Jackson thought, if it were him, he would have given both items to a single person.
Or maybe not.
Wouldn't that person then be able to easily assassinate their superiors? Was it meant as a way to keep each other in check? Perhaps that was the intention. Indeed, the dead leader had used the 2 dolls to keep each other in check. But now that he was dead, his mouth would tell no tales. Jackson opened his senses on the rooftop. He could feel ominous killing intent from all around.
Quite a few.
The entire village was a den of thieves. But that wouldn't be a problem. The Black Blade Bandits didn't realize they were facing a force that had over 100 combat-ready men, including someone of knight-level strength. Had they known the true identities of Enkrid and his companions, they would never have attacked. But ignorance often leads to misfortune. Finn kicked the sword away and rolled to the side, raising her wrist. The short sword flew clumsily, but as soon as the blade flew toward the enemy dodged. He shifted his body to the side, but even as he dodged, he kept his eyes on Finn. In that brief moment, Finn used the wrist-mounted device, a gift from Enkrid, to fire a short arrow. The arrow flew, but the enemy swung a club, blocking the arrow. With a loud noise, the arrow veered to the side. The eyes of the man who had swung the club were filled with killing intent.
Damn it.
Isn't it pretty dark right now? Even with the moonlight, it's still quite dim. But he managed to deflect that short arrow in this darkness. That means he fights at least as well as the border guard unit. Even though they were overshadowed by Enkrid and the Independent Company, Finn knew that these opponents were no pushovers. Finn was also well aware of her own strengths and weaknesses. She had an advantage in close-quarters combat, but when it came to fighting with weapons, she was at a disadvantage. She had many skills outside of combat, but when it came to individual tactics, this was the case. So, what should she do? As always, she needed to create an opening and close the distance. After rolling on the ground and quickly assessing the situation, Finn honestly thought this was pretty dangerous.
Damn it, this is a mess.
The man with a foul mouth said, patting his crotch.
You're going to regret this.
If she got caught, it wouldn't end well for her. Damn it, she had to escape somehow. Finn was even prepared to make a run for it if things got worse, but she quickly felt relieved.
Finally, about time.
She saw Sinar, who had vanished without a trace, now silently slitting the throat of the crossbowman who had been aiming at Finn. The touch of the fairy was as cold and sharp as ever. Blood sprayed into the air like a fountain. The light faded from the crossbowman's eyes as his carotid artery was severed. Behind the falling archer, short daggers gleamed in the dark, and it looked as though only Sinar's emerald eyes floated in the shadows. The darkness enveloped her.
Bitch.
The remaining man cursed, still foul-mouthed. Ignoring him, Finn charged at the third man, who was stunned by the sudden turn of events. There had been 3 men waiting for her. One had already been dispatched by Sinar's dagger, leaving 2. The last man clumsily brandished a dagger, exposing a massive opening. Finn lowered her stance and rushed forward. The opponent swung his blade downward, but Finn had predicted this move and twisted her body to the side. Using the momentum, she kicked off the ground and shot upward from below. It was an Ale Karras-style tackle. The man, who had been watching in a daze, had his wrist seized, his arm twisted into an unnatural angle.
Ugh.
Shut up.
Finn spoke as she continued to break the man's finger bones. Tears streamed from the man's eyes. Snot and drool ran down his face, and his eyes rolled back in pain. Finn grabbed the man's neck and twisted it to the side. The man, his neck broken, collapsed forward. All of this happened in a rapid sequence of movements. In the background, there were curses. Damn it, crazy.
You bitch.
Coming from somewhere nearby. While Finn was busy breaking the man's joints and eventually snapping his neck, Sinar had gifted the foul-mouthed man 2 holes, one in his heart and one in his throat with her dagger. The man was now on the ground, trembling. Instead of words, blood poured from his mouth as he tried to speak. Thick, dark red blood spilled under the moonlight. In front of him, Sinar turned her gaze indifferently without a word. Blood splattered from the corpse had left specks on her face. Her pale face, with its inhuman beauty, now adorned with a few drops of crimson blood, was illuminated by the moonlight. It looked like the face of some nameless work of art. The living artwork turned its gaze to Finn and spoke.
Things have gone wrong.
It doesn't seem like it will be a problem.
Finn replied. From the way things were unfolding, it seemed like things were getting complicated. But would it really be a problem? Probably not. Who had come along with them? It was Enkrid and Jackson, wasn't it? With Enkrid's brute swordsmanship, it felt like he could just slice through half of these bandits. What kind of loyalty would a band of bandits have to just stand by and watch that? Half of them would probably run away while watching. Dangerous? Probably not. Finn could see how the crowd, especially the bandits, would react. It was predictable. In the worst-case scenario, even if every single one of them decided to attack, there was still Enkrid. He wouldn't just sit back and let himself get beaten.
I smell magic.
The fairy Sinar spoke. Her senses were sharp. Finn frowned. A wizard, huh? That could be a bit troublesome. It was hard to predict how that variable would play out. Even so,
Doesn't seem like we'd get beaten.
especially since Enkrid wasn't alone. Finn had experience living within the Madmen platoon. She knew that Jackson wasn't ordinary either. That's why she said what she did.
That's that. But it seems like they're paying less attention to us.
Her intention was to let them handle their own business while they focused on their own. Her eyes swept across the village center. It was the place where Enkrid was causing a commotion. There was a spot, visible even in the dark night thanks to the torches that lit it up. It was the village's central square. She could see people, specifically bandits, gathering one by one.
Exactly. We should probably investigate what we need to first, right?
Finn thought to herself, no matter how dangerous it was Enkrid. He knew how to get himself out of trouble. Sinar also nodded. There was one problem, but she understood what had to be prioritized. The village center was where the bandits had dug their burrow. Checking out what was happening inside, there came first. It was worth it. Sinar and Finn had been tracking those signs all this time. It had only been a month since he joined this village. His name was Bond. He had been doing mercenary work when greed suddenly took hold of him, leading him to stab a fellow in the back. Well, it was a common story. The greed to keep the reward all to himself. The mistake he made was that the bastard he stabbed didn't die quietly. The guy had a brother who was a guard for some noble. Soon enough, Bond found himself on the run from the guards.
Talk about rotten luck.
He was born to a whore.
Why don't you just go die?
When he couldn't stand his mother's nagging anymore, he ran away and started drifting through the alleys behind the estate. His life had been a mess since then. His habit of backstabbing earned him the name Bond, and he transitioned into being a mercenary. But even here, he couldn't kick the habit. He stabbed a comrade in the back, and the situation pushed him into a corner. How many places could someone like him go? He had barely started to adapt to the Black Blade bandits, and now this. And the most important thing he learned during his month here was twofold. First, if you defied the village leader, you'd be burned to death before you knew what hit you. Second, you shouldn't mess with the guards who trailed off at the end of their sentences, or the woman who used claws. After seeing a guy's tongue get cut out for making one wrong remark, he swore he wouldn't even glance at that woman's thighs. He avoided making eye contact with her as much as possible.
But I recognized their faces. I needed to avoid them.
Bond thought to himself that those two were the very symbols of strength that protected this village, and now those two symbols had truly become just that. Subbles, they might as well have been treated like immovable statues. Of course, they didn't remain in any pleasing form. In reality, all Bond could see was something flashing and flying around. Among the onlookers there were others like him, standing dazed with rusty short swords, hammers, slingshots, blackjacks filled with sand, or spiked clubs in their hands. Some were trying to be more proactive, throwing daggers or darts, while over 10 archers with crossbows had taken their positions. But none of them had any time to react.
Okay.
All eyes were on the two symbols, who were now letting out sounds that could have been screams or groans. No one could tell. The guard who usually trailed off at the end of his sentences had been using a short spear about the length of his forearm. He had been a mercenary before, and Bond had heard that he was quite skilled back in those days. But now, just as the spear tip seemed to meet the edge of the blade, his head was severed. It was real. The moment the weapons touched, wait, had they even touched? The head was cleanly cut off. It was something Bond couldn't comprehend. All he saw was the blade of the man with the black hair meeting the spear, and then it sliced through the other's neck.
Shouldn't there have been a clashing sound if the weapons met?
But no, this was the fluid sword technique, the swordsmanship created by Enkrid, which utterly overwhelmed the opponent. It wasn't that the blade was soft, but that it was so sharp and deftly struck that it cut through the enemy as if they were made of nothing. Afterward, the woman with the claws had tried to attack from behind, but something flashed from below to above, and she was split in two. Just like that, the second symbol was divided into two bodies, and that was the end of it. What had just happened? Bond had heard tales of swordsmen with ghostly skills, But this felt like something out of a dream, like he had been bewitched. The gap in skill was so vast that it made the swordsmanship appear to be a kind of spell. Bond's body froze. Should he even try to fight? He'd be dead in an instant. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get out of there right away.
Huh?
The crossbow-wielding archer uttered a dumbfounded exclamation.
Move aside.
The true ruler of the village stepped forward through the band of thieves. Bond instinctively began to retreat, but then stopped. A woman came into view. Her name was Kaisela, a woman with curly brown hair, softly curved eyes, thick lips, and prominent breasts and hips. Kaisela, who rested one hand on her narrow waist accentuated by her chest and hips, frowned. This was after she had seen the two corpses. As soon as she appeared, the monster who had split the two symbols made a sweeping gesture. In an instant, the opponent pulled out a knife and threw it. Of course, Bond couldn't see any of this. It was too fast. All he could do was see the end result, skipping the entire process and draw conclusions from it. The blade thrown by the man thudded harmlessly against an invisible barrier. The furrow in Kaisela's brow deepened. Whenever that happened, villagers tended to disappear, or entire groups who had wandered into the village by chance would vanish without a trace. If not that, then someone would end up dead.
There's no hesitation in him.
She spoke, her voice resonating like crystal. Beside her, the eyes of the panther began to glow a fierce blue. Though Bond couldn't see that either. Bond still didn't understand what was happening, but he knew something was about to go down. The thought of running away had completely vanished. He couldn't move, as if someone had glued his feet to the ground. Kaisela's fingertip pointed directly at Enkrid. The man didn't move an inch. At least, that's how it appeared to Bond. He just stood there with his sword in his right hand, facing Kaisela's outstretched finger.
Strike him down.
Kaisela's voice flowed out at the same time. Crack! There was no warning, no sign. With a deafening roar that seemed to tear the sky apart, a blue lightning bolt struck down. It hit precisely above the man's head. Bond couldn't see anything as his vision was filled with blinding light. The light then pushed him back with a sudden force. He was thrown backward by the shockwave, but there was no time to even register the sensation of floating. No, he didn't even remember it. When Bond regained his senses, all he could see in front of him was the dirt ground.
Grah.
He heard a groan, or something similar, echoing in his ears. It wasn't his own voice, but he quickly realized he was also letting out a similar sound. Bond twisted his body halfway, struggling to get up. He saw bodies that had been half-burned. There were comrades who had turned into blackened husks.
What was that? What happened?
The pain hadn't fully registered in his body yet. The shock was that immense. The memory of the moment he was hit had been wiped out. Bond slowly, painstakingly, began to move. He was better off than most. His entire body wasn't burnt. The pain surged through his body only once he became aware of it, starting from his right arm. He unknowingly clenched his teeth. He looked down at his right arm. From his right arm down to his thigh, his skin was blackened, as if it had been seared and charred. The burning pain made it difficult for him to stay conscious.
It was lightning. Lightning.
He remembered seeing lightning strike quite close to him once when he was a child. White fire, an invisible force of light. The memory of that lightning's flash came to his mind. His thoughts were still hazy. In a way, that was a blessing. Otherwise, he would have been screaming in agony. Just being nearby had burned most of his hair, and it felt like someone had shoved a ball of fire down his throat. Bond blinked a few times. His eyes were still functioning. As his mind started to clear, the pain became sharper and more overwhelming. Bond silently screamed, unable to do anything but stagger, as cold sweat poured down his face. It felt like a swarm of rats was gnawing at his flesh. He thought he was standing, but he wasn't. He had backed away. Crawling on his rear, his back hit a wall. The cool touch of the wall seemed to slightly ease the pain. Only then was he able to look ahead. The distance between him and the black-haired attacker was over 15 paces, at least from what he could gauge, and yet he was in this state. What could have happened to the man who was at the center of that spell? He must be dead. Even if he had been burned to ashes while standing, Bond wouldn't have been surprised. Considering his own condition, those who had been closer had died, burnt black. Then Bond noticed someone who was completely unscathed.
How?
A new figure stood beside her. It was a woman with long black hair and a gray robe. She raised one hand in the air as her lips parted.
A lightning spell, huh? Quite useful.
There was something about her tone, something akin to an adult watching a child's antics. It was condescending, dismissive. She was mercilessly judging the opponent's level. Even while choking and gasping from the lightning strike, Bond could sense the emotion, or lack thereof, behind those words. The caster of the spell surely couldn't have missed this either.
A madman and a madwoman.
Kaisela spoke again, moving her fingers. Indecipherable words began to spill from her lips, the start of a spell. Yet Bond for a moment forgot his pain and couldn't tear his gaze away from the woman with the black hair. She was a beauty with a unique charm that seemed to draw in all the attention and awareness around her. Her black hair, whatever she had done to it, flowed like silk. Her lips were red and her eyes were blue. She was full of mystery. If Kaisela had a body that awakened desire, this woman had a face that inspired awe. Even as Bond thoughtlessly admired her, he cursed himself for being so foolish to lose himself in her gaze. Of course, he wasn't the only one. As soon as Enkrid sensed the presence of a wizard, he tensed his thighs. Since his thrown blade had been blocked, now he would just cut her down himself. At that moment, something fell from above at a speed impossible for a human body to follow. As soon as he realized and felt it, his body reacted to the destructive flash. He split time and prepared to defend, raising his arms to shield his head, simultaneously.
I will.
A whisper and a murmur came from beside him. No, to be precise, it was said before the light flashed overhead, but Enkrid perceived the light first and only registered the voice afterward. By then, Esther had already transformed into her human form, wearing a gray robe. She had her right hand extended forward, palm open, and that was the end of it. Enkrid's sixth sense, beyond his 5 ordinary senses, detected that 2 spells had collided. Something similar to the invisible barrier that had blocked his dagger now shielded him from the destructive lightning before it could strike his head. Then the lightning struck. The impact sent the surrounding bandits flying in all directions. Enkrid watched as the invisible barrier held off the mass of light. It was a semi-transparent barrier with a soft blue glow. When it met the lightning, the barrier scattered the light, which shot off in all directions. The newly spawned light rays bounced away and didn't return. The stray bolts of light burned and pierced through those nearby. Thanks to Esther's spell, half of the lightning was blocked, and the other half was deflected.
Vanna's mirror?
The opponent murmured, her eyes showing a hint of surprise. Esther didn't even shrug. Her attitude made it clear she didn't care in the slightest what the other woman said. Arrogant and proud, but it didn't seem out of place. It was as if she was naturally meant to be that way. Enkrid once again noticed the mysterious allure of Esther's appearance, but it didn't sway him in the slightest. If he had been the type to be swayed by a woman's appearance, he wouldn't have been able to stubbornly walk his path all this time. The opponent began chanting another spell, and Esther also muttered words that were impossible to understand. Somewhere the sound of insects chirping began to emerge, as blue light flickered in Kaisela's hand before quickly transforming into lightning. This time it didn't strike from above but zigzagged forward from her fingertips. Esther raised her hand to meet it. The lightning struck, but it was blocked by the transparent barrier and was reflected back. The flashing light left afterimages on Bond's retina.
Vanish.
Kaisela shouted hastily. For some reason, blood trickled from the corner of her mouth.
Tsk. Child. What are you doing reversing the spell you just cast? Especially when you can't even handle the backlash of the mana.
Kaisela's expression hardened at Esther's rebuke. She was flustered, and understandably so. When facing a swordsman, she never lost. This village was filled with things she had prepared. A prepared wizard can kill 100 and hold off 1,000. But there was no way around it when facing a wizard of a higher rank. This was an established fact. Kaisela glared at the woman who had suddenly appeared. No, at the woman who had transformed from a panther.
Who are you?
Esther did not reveal her name. She simply looked down on her opponent, and she had every right to do so. There was at least a 3-tier difference between Esther's magical world and that of the curly-haired woman.
This is impossible.
Kaisela muttered. How could such a wizard appear in this remote corner of the world? And what could she possibly gain from being here? Arrogance is a trait of wizards, selfishness and narrow-mindedness too. Kaisela began to chant once again in words that were incomprehensible. She was casting a spell to bring her magical world into reality. Esther watched for a moment before taking a step forward. She also began chanting a spell as she advanced. All eyes were on her as she moved. No one dared to fire a crossbow or attack her. More than 5 crossbowmen had survived the lightning's impact, but they didn't move a muscle. Enkrid, too, became a spectator.
She's got some skill.
That was all he thought as he stood there. He knew Esther was a wizard, but he hadn't known at what level now. It seemed she was far superior to that sensuous woman named Kaisela standing before them. That was enough. He had never expected much from Esther, to begin with. In truth, Enkrid had never expected much from anyone around him. He simply walked his path, and others followed because they found it fascinating.
How dare you?
Kaisela shouted. Enkrid couldn't understand what was happening between the two of them. He only knew that no magic, spell, or any mystical event was occurring. There was just a trembling in the air between them, a sign that something was happening, something invisible to the eye. Soon, Esther stood before Kaisela. Kaisela was taller, and her voluptuous figure made Esther's body seem slender in comparison. However, Enkrid had already seen that Esther was naked beneath her robe. Through the slight gaps that appeared as she raised her hands, he had glimpsed everything. Enkrid's sight and senses were already exceptional, allowing him to visualize the entire picture from just a few glimpses. Even though it was hidden, Esther's body was not inferior to her opponent's sensual figure.
Is that all you have to show on the surface?
Esther spoke as she stood before Kaisela. Her tone and gaze were unmistakably dismissive of Kaisela's physique. Esther saw Enkrid's gaze sweep over Kaisela's entire body. Having observed Enkrid for quite some time, she didn't miss that glance. Kaisela was wearing clothes that clearly revealed her figure. Her face wasn't ugly, but that was all there was to it. Maybe it would catch Frog's eye, but not hers. It was below standard.
No, it's just that frog named Mailrun had particularly low standards.
Enkrid had casually mentioned it on their way here, so she also knew what that frog named Mailrun had said, and what kind of place this town was. That's why she had anticipated the prepared spell, and had already made her own preparations internally. Esther's eyes stared indifferently at her opponent. Not only was her appearance lacking, but what was with that ominous spell? She really thought she could burn off that man's hair or something with that. In reality, a lightning spell couldn't kill Enkrid. Though it was a prepared spell, Enkrid's body could now withstand it. Moreover, Esther herself had made several precautions in the new armor he had acquired. But does that mean she should forgive someone who would do such a thing? Esther was originally far from the concept of forgiveness. Whatever her opponent tried, she interfered with and dismantled it one by one as the world of spells unfolded. Mana gathered and then scattered. The opponent, who had already had her insides twisted by the spell Vanna's mirror, had her complexion pale. As the repeated spells failed, her face grew more ashen. When Esther approached right in front of her, Cadil pulled out a dagger hidden at her waist and stabbed. As she did, she shouted, "Fire!" The crossbowman who had been hesitating reacted. Without any concern, Esther struck Kaisela's wrist, which held the dagger. She revealed the most useful thing she had gained from the curse, a hand strike using the strength of a panther. As the sharply raised hand struck the opponent's wrist, a clear and solid sound of bones breaking was heard. Kaisela's wrist, unable to withstand the strength from such a slender hand, snapped. It dangled loosely.
Kia.
The one who had ruled and terrorized the village screamed. The bolt fired by the startled crossbowman was blocked by Enkrid, who had moved swiftly. He deflected 2 bolts with his sword and caught the third one in midair. The moment the onlookers saw him catch a flying arrow, the faces of the bandits turned pale. Wasn't this a level they couldn't possibly overcome?
You should stay still while you're still being spared.
Enkrid spoke quietly. All the bandits trembled and dropped their weapons. Some, quick on the uptake, started to retreat. There were too many to chase after individually, so they were left alone. Esther snatched the dagger from Kaisela's hand and turned it into a brooch on her heart. As the dagger plunged deep, piercing and twisting her heart, Kaisela gurgled and muttered,
Why?
"Why is a wizard as powerful as you here?" That was the question.
It's none of your concern.
Esther muttered with a smile. she felt a slight satisfaction. Enkrid, who had been watching, approached.
You fight well.
Fairly well.
In response to her quiet answer, Enkrid nodded and looked around. When a wizard appeared, clenched their teeth, and fought at the right timing, Esther had taken care of everything on her own. He didn't mind that. If she wanted to take the lead, that wasn't a problem. Enkrid also considered Esther a member of his subordinates. Whatever she did, it would probably be better than Rem. Those who lost their will to fight, those who were startled by the lightning, those who stared blankly, and from behind them.
Drop all your weapons.
The Fairy Company commander's unit was seen entering the village, surrounding the area, and beginning their advance.
How did they know to come at this exact timing?
Esther wondered as she observed the scene. A man who appeared to be the platoon leader hurriedly approached. He quickly glanced around, his expression clearly showing confusion.
All of you, huh? Did you already drop your weapons?
He muttered in surprise as he passed by. He was flustered, but would asking the enemy really yield any answers?
They told us to drop them.
One of the men, with his right arm completely burned black, mumbled. You could see in his eyes that he was desperate to survive.
Drop them just because you were told to.
The platoon leader asked again. Enkrid wondered what kind of exchange this was, merely staring blankly at the short-haired side of the platoon leader's head, where his scalp was showing. From the platoon leader's perspective, the situation was absurd. They had been observing the village from afar and noticed an unusual increase in torches, sensing that something was amiss. He had decided to advance the unit on his own judgment, and as they approached the village, several lightning strikes, seemingly from spells, hastened their entry. But upon entering, everything was already over. The village had been turned into chaos by just a few people, and there seemed to have been a bandit who could use spells. But that wizard was now dead with a dagger in their heart. The survivors had lost the will to fight, and the rest were dead. That was all he could see. The platoon leader couldn't grasp the full context of what had happened, but one thing was certain.
This is terrifying.
Even more so than his usual impression of his company commander, he felt a deep fear. And here there were people even more frightening.
Do you want me to pluck out your eyes?
A voice said, as the platoon leader's gaze was naturally drawn to the faintly visible skin through a robe. The words made him freeze. Black hair, red lips, blue eyes, a mysterious aura, the moonlight falling on her, and a curvaceous figure. Everything about her captured his attention in an instant. It was natural for a man, but despite only a brief glance, the words that came out of her mouth were chilling.
We're allies. You can't pluck them out. What about burning them? That's not allowed either. Then, should I just blind one eye? You could just look away.
Disappointing. So the problem isn't his eyes, then?
In truth, Esther was awkward with human affairs and most things. Enkrid thought as he spoke, training her would be a challenge. Anyway.
I saw it too. Are you going to pluck out my eyes?
You're an exception.
What?
Never mind.
Esther said, pretending to think for a moment, then shook her head. She then nodded, agreeing to leave the eyes alone. Enkrid sighed lightly and gave the platoon leader a look before saying,
Round them up and tie them all up.
Yes. But where are you going?
Inside.
Neither Finn, Jackson, nor Sonar had returned. They must have gone inside. The village chief's house in the center of the village was quite large. It looked like a good place to hide something.
There's a smell of magic,
Esther remarked. Enkrid also sensed that something was there. Esther confidently moved first. Enkrid stood by her side.
Do you know where you're going?
He asked, just in case she might be like Ragna.
Do you take me for some idiot who can't even find their way?
She retorted. So she thought of Ragna like that all along. Enkrid mused silently as he responded.
No, you're not an idiot like that.
Then the two entered the village, and the platoon leader, who had been surveying the remaining enemies, shouted,
If you act recklessly, I'll start by plucking out your eyes.
With that, he and his men began tying up the remaining bandits, taking control of the area. At that point, Sinar, Jackson, and Finn were already inside the tunnel that had been dug beneath the village center. Inside, there were still a few things left that the wizard had prepared, for example, ghouls and lycanthropes. But naturally, they were no match for the group and were all cut down, slashed, and killed. When the three reached the inside, what they saw was a scene too horrific to put into words.
Medicine. Give me medicine.
One of the people who had become part of the carnage muttered. A person was scratching the wall so hard that all their fingernails had peeled off, causing blood to drip down. A small child had collapsed between them, drooling. There were no words to describe it other than a massacre. There were ghoul corpses, lycanthropes with severed heads and arms, and even a couple of dog-like creatures with human faces. Judging by the collars around their necks, it seemed they were used as guard dogs by those here. Those creatures had also been split in half. A path paved with the blood of monsters led to the chief's house, which had an unusual structure. Inside, there was a slope. It led downward into a tunnel. It felt like a large cave. Though there was no wind, the interior seemed quite spacious.
A wide enclosed cave.
It was the perfect place to do something sinister. Enkrid and Esther stepped inside. Torches placed along the walls provided visibility. As Enkrid looked at the corpses of the monsters, he noticed signs of Sinar and Jackson.
Looks like they did a good job cutting them down.
They arrived at a rather large chamber. Inside, Sinar, Finn, and Jackson were already there.
You're here early,
Jackson remarked. Enkrid detected a slight awkwardness in his tone. There were a few more tunnels branching off within the chamber, and he noticed some areas barred with iron grates. Inside those barred areas were people. They looked like they were halfway out of their minds. Enkrid approached them. Among them he noticed an older man he hadn't seen before, muttering to himself. He had a stubborn-looking face, with a hooked nose, sunken cheeks, prominent cheekbones, and small eyes. He didn't seem like an ordinary character.
Could you shut up?
Finn said menacingly, holding a dagger that reflected the torchlight. But the old man just pouted his lips stubbornly. Light didn't penetrate well into the interior. Enkrid grabbed one of the torches hanging on the wall. He illuminated the inside.
Medicine. Medicine, do you have it? Give me medicine. I'll treat you well.
The old man muttered. She was a woman, so emaciated that her chest seemed to cave inward. Just by looking into her eyes, it was clear. She wasn't just drugged, there wasn't a shred of sanity left in her. If left like this, she would spend the rest of her life wandering, searching for more drugs, until she eventually died.
Do you have any drugs?
She asked. This was one of the better cases. There was a man nearby, scratching the wall, even though his fingernails were broken and bleeding. His eyes had been gouged out by someone. Next to him, a small child lay drooling on the ground, and Enkrid knew that the child was already dead. There wasn't the slightest sign of life that indicated the child was alive. The chest wasn't rising and falling. No breath could be heard.
He was alive until just a moment ago.
Finn muttered from behind. Sinar was busy surveying the surroundings. She was a fairy, and regardless of the horror or anything else, she diligently did her job. She searched for hidden items in various places.
Hey, do you even know what that is before you touch it?
The hooked-nosed older man shouted. In the meantime, Enkrid quietly inspected the tunnel, one by one, silently and diligently.
Leave it alone.
Sinar ignored the man's protests, and when he saw Finn's eyes darkening, he didn't dare push further. No matter how confident he was, he couldn't risk provoking someone who might throw a knife at him. With a small huff, he snorted and turned away. Folding his arms, Sinar continued to handle various objects. In the next tunnel, Enkrid saw something strange. It was a person, but half of their eyes were an odd color. Dull, colorless, pupilless eyes. Black eyes, with clearly visible split muscle fibers in his thighs.
What is this?
Enkrid asked without looking away.
Oh, that's a failed experiment.
The older man replied indifferently.
A failed experiment.
It didn't turn out right.
Was it originally human?
What's the point in asking?
Enkrid silently looked at the creature, then swung his sword. The blade passed through the bars, killing the half-ghoul, half-human creature that had been wheezing. There were several such creatures in the tunnels.
The lycanthropes we saw on the way here were similar.
Jackson's voice came indifferent and colder than usual. Enkrid turned his head back. He also moved his feet. He didn't express anger, nor did he show sorrow. Finn watched Enkrid. Was he not angry because it was a path already walked? Something that couldn't be undone? Or was it more like the reaction of the fairy? Was he distancing himself from the events, not accepting the horror as something connected to him? Finn noticed a particular difference between humans and Sinar in this situation. She showed no emotion in response to the carnage.
A wretch who deserves to be torn apart.
Finn murmured. After that single remark, they set about their tasks. The primary reason they had come here to verify whether the drugs and other matters were linked to any nobles was investigated one by one. It would be helpful if they found any clues here. That way they could identify those who deserved punishment, although it was uncertain whether finding them would justify killing them on the spot. Enkrid walked over, his steps heavy. Finn, still holding her sword, watched him. Jackson was behind him, but he didn't seem to have any intention of killing their opponent. As soon as they arrived, Jackson had asked a few questions, received answers, and then stepped back. He seemed to consider it none of his business. Finn felt a deep sadness. She felt it when she saw the dead child, when she saw the woman drugged out of her mind, and as she imagined the screams and horrors that must have filled this place. Emotionally, she wanted to cut down this alchemist right then and there, but that wasn't something Finn could decide on her own. This man was quite famous. His name was well known throughout the kingdom. The alchemist Laban. He couldn't create gold from nothing, but when it came to making potions, there was no one who could rival him.
Hey, I was forced into this. The black blade made me do it.
Laban muttered, perhaps sensing something. He said this as Enkrid came right up to him. Esther, who had transformed from a panther back into a human, silently observed Enkrid. But it wasn't just Esther. Everyone's gaze shifted to Enkrid, Jackson. Sinar, who had stopped what she was doing, everyone. What would he do? Even just capturing and sending him to the kingdom would be a significant accomplishment. Laban's value wasn't just in his body, but in the knowledge in his head. What if they erased his debt with this incident? He was an alchemist, after all. He might even give them healing potions, which could be as good as an extra life. He experimented on humans, but was that really wrong? How many of the top alchemists on the continent hadn't used human bodies for their experiments? And wasn't this all because the Black Blade had ordered it? If a blade kills someone, who is the target of revenge? The blade itself or the person wielding it? Enkrid looked into Laban's eyes. There was no hint of guilt in those rotten, decayed eyes.